The Duke was ready to execute her, until he saw the scars covering her body. Whitmore, Derbyshire. The 14th of January, 1874. The courtyard of Whitmore Hall was a study in the colour of resignation. Snow had fallen in the night and refused, in the morning, to look anything but grey, not the clean white of winter postcards or the silver of poets, but the exhausted grey of old tallow, of ash that had sat too long in the grate. The walls of the hall rose on three sides, their stone darkened by decades of coal smoke and damp, and the gate through which the constables had passed some 20 minutes prior still stood open, admitting a blade of wind that cut across the cobblestones and troubled no one's composure except that of a junior clerk who kept pressing his hat to his head with one gloved hand. Wilson Alexander, Duke of Oakshire, did not feel the cold. He had long ago decided that feeling it was a choice, and he had declined. He stood at the centre of the courtyard in his grey coat and his grey dignity, and he reviewed the arrangements with the quiet thoroughness of a man who understood that the law was only as credible as its procedures. The gallows had been erected to specification. The witnesses, 6 in total, as required, stood in a loose arc to his left, their breath clouding before them in small silent puffs. The prison chaplain held his prayer book with both hands. The court recorder stood at the edge of the assembly with his notebook, already open. It had begun to snow again, finally, almost apologetically. Wilson had overseen 11 executions. He did not count them as achievements, nor did he permit himself to count them as failures. They were conclusions, the terminal punctuation of cases that the courts had already decided. His role was not to revisit those decisions but to honor them with precision. This, he believed, was what separated civilized authority from the mob. The mob acted on feeling, the law acted on procedure. Wilson Alexander was, in all things, a man of procedure. He turned to the constable at his right. "Bring her out." There was a pause, brief, institutional. And then the door at the far end of the courtyard opened and the condemned woman was escorted into the grey morning. Wilson watched her come without expression. Millicent White, aged 29, convicted of the murder of her husband, Lewis Archibald White, by a jury of 12 men who had deliberated for 3 hours and 40 minutes before returning a unanimous verdict. She had been sentenced at the autumn assizes, and the execution had been delayed once already on account of an illness that the prison physician had considered genuine and Wilson had considered inconvenient. She walked steadily between her 2 escorts, which he noted. He had seen condemned persons carried, collapsed, praying aloud, or rigid with a terror that robbed the limbs of purpose. She walked. She wore a plain grey dress, prison issue, with a collar that reached her jaw. Her hair had been put up efficiently, if not kindly, to expose the neck. Her face, as she came closer, was composed in the way of a person who has decided that composure is the last thing remaining to them, and who intends to keep it. She stopped before him. Standard protocol required a final confirmation of identity, a formality, a procedural courtesy, the last acknowledgement that the condemned was a person before the machinery of the law converted her into a concluded matter. Wilson reached out, as he had done 11 times before, to lift the condemned's chin. It was at this moment that the torn seam gave way. The dress was old and had been mended once already, and the motion of walking in the cold, the small repeated hunch of shoulders against the wind, had worked at a weakness along the left shoulder seam until, in the stillness of her stopping, it came apart. It was not a dramatic tearing. It was a quiet surrender, a few inches of fabric parting along a line that had been weakening for hours, and it caused the back of the dress to shift, to gape, to fold inward upon itself across the upper left side, from the shoulder blade down past the mid-spine. Wilson Alexander looked. He was not a man given to shock. He had seen, in the course of his career, evidence of most of the cruelties that one person may visit upon another. He had reviewed photographs, read physicians' reports, sat through testimonies delivered in the flat, careful language of those who have decided that precision is preferable to feeling. He was not easily disturbed. He looked at Millicent White's back, and for the first time in 11 executions, he felt the ground shift beneath his certainty. The scars were overlapping, layered, one upon another, in the way of something applied not once but repeatedly, over time, with method. Some were old and pale, sunk into the skin like riverbeds long dry. Others were newer, still faintly raised, the color of old brick in lamplight. They covered the visible expanse of her back from the shoulder to the waist in a pattern that could not, by any reading of any evidence, be the result of a single incident, or an accident, or fall. They were a record. They were the meticulous, physical archive of someone who had been doing this for years. He stood very still. The courtyard was quiet except for the wind and the soft percussion of snowflakes landing on the clerk's hat brim. The witnesses had not seen. The chaplain was looking at his prayer book. The constables flanking the woman were looking straight ahead, as constables are trained to do. Only Wilson had seen. Only Wilson was looking, now, at the back of a woman the law had decided was a murderer, and reading, in the evidence of her skin, the possibility that the law had made a catastrophic error. He lowered his hand. He did not touch her chin. He did not complete the protocol. Instead, he raised one hand, open-palmed, towards the gallows, and said, quietly, without drama, as if announcing a minor procedural adjustment, "Halt." The word fell into the grey morning and sat there. The chaplain looked up. The court recorder's pencil stopped. The two constables, trained for many contingencies, had not been trained for this one, and so they did what people do when authority speaks an unexpected word: they waited. Wilson lowered his hand. He looked, once, at Millicent White's face. She had not moved. Her expression had not changed. There was something in her eyes, not hope, precisely, which would have been too large a thing to carry in that moment, but something that recognized, very quietly, that something was different. "Return the prisoner to her cell," Wilson said, "and send for the prison physician. I require full forensic examination before this proceeding continues." He turned toward the court recorder. "Nothing has been concluded this morning. Note the time. Note that the execution has been suspended pending a proper inquiry." He pulled his coat straight. He did not explain himself further. He was a man who had spent 23 years making decisions of consequence, and he had learned that the decision that costs the most is not the difficult one but the one you nearly carried out before you looked properly. He had looked properly. Now he intended to look further. The courtyard began, slowly, to empty. The snow continued to fall, fine and purposeless, settling on the cobblestones in a thin white patience, as if it had learned to wait. Welcome to Forbidden Diaries. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy the story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The Fielding house had been managing genteel poverty for so long that it had become almost an art form. The rugs in the front parlor were turned at a precise angle to conceal the threadbare patches at their centers. The silver on the dining table was polished to a brightness that discouraged close inspection of its weight. The garden, which had once employed 2 men full-time, now employed 1 man on alternating Thursdays, and the effect was a sort of controlled wilderness, not unkempt, exactly, but alive with the slightly desperate energy of things that have been left to their own devices for slightly too long. Millicent Fielding understood all of this. She had grown up inside it, as one grows up inside a smell, so gradually and completely that she no longer noticed the particular shape of it. She knew, at 22, exactly which floorboard on the upper landing must be stepped over, which chair in the drawing room was not to be sat upon by guests, and which questions about her father's business dealings were not to be asked. She was not unhappy. She was simply shaped, as people are shaped, by the precise contours of her circumstances. She was also, as her mother frequently reminded her, not getting any younger. Margaret Fielding stated this observation at intervals that suggested she found it either newly alarming or deeply consoling, depending on her mood. Millie's mother was a woman of considerable feeling and very little patience, who had married a man she adored and then discovered, across 25 years of marriage, that adoration was not a reliable financial strategy. She loved her husband genuinely and blamed him quietly and continuously for the gap between the life she had imagined and the life she inhabited, and she had decided, with the practical ferocity of a woman who has thought the matter through, that her daughter would not repeat her mistake. Her daughter would marry well. Her daughter would marry a man with money, and with standing, and with the kind of face that appeared trustworthy in church, which was, in her mother's considered view, the only face that mattered at the altar. Whether such a man was interesting, or kind, or possessed of any quality that would be visible in private rather than public, was a secondary concern. Millie did not share this view entirely, but she had also not been asked. Lewis White arrived in Cumberland on a Wednesday afternoon in April, in a carriage that was not ostentatious but was, quietly and undeniably, expensive. He was 41 years old to Millie's 22, with silver at his temples and a manner that suggested he had spent those 19 extra years learning precisely how to move through a room so that other people turned toward him without knowing they had done so. He was not handsome in any simple way, but he was present, a quality that Millie, who had grown up in a household where her father was often absent and her mother was often anxious, found herself responding to before she had decided whether to. He had come, ostensibly, to discuss a business matter with Robert Fielding, some question of land deeds and the survey of a shared boundary in the Southern Valley. He had called ahead, been invited to supper, and arrived with a bottle of whiskey that Robert Fielding described to his wife afterward as absolutely remarkable in a tone that suggested he had not tasted anything comparable in some years. Lewis White knew how to give gifts. This was the first thing Milly noticed about him, the deliberateness of it. The whiskey was not an afterthought. The compliment he paid her mother regarding the arrangement of the dining table was not flattery but observation. He specified what he admired, which made it credible. When he spoke with her father about the land business, he leaned slightly forward, as if her father's words were valuable, which they were not particularly, but which made Robert Fielding sit straighter and speak with more authority than he usually managed. The second thing Milly noticed was the way his eyes moved. They were not unkind eyes, they were, in fact, rather beautiful, dark and attentive. But they moved across a room the way that a man takes stock of an estate he is considering purchasing, pausing on each element, assessing, moving on. When they settled on Milly, across the supper table, she had the brief, peculiar sensation of being appraised. It was not a sensation she could have named at 22, and she dismissed it as vanity, the assumption that she had been looked at particularly when in fact she had simply been looked at. She told herself this firmly and ate her soup. Lewis White came to supper 3 more times in April. On the third occasion, he brought flowers for Milly's mother and a small volume of Tennyson. For Miss Fielding, if she reads, which he presented without ceremony, as if it were a minor thing, which somehow made it feel more significant than if he had presented it with speeches. He asked Milly, at supper, whether she preferred the lakes or the dales for walking, and listened to her answer with the full attention of a man who has decided that what she thinks is the most interesting thing in the room. She found him charming. She could not have said precisely why this made her uneasy, except that charm, in her experience, was a performance, and she could not quite see what lay behind the performance, which was not necessarily sinister but was not quite nothing either. She kept this observation to herself. She was 22 and it was 1867, and the observation of young women regarding the men who courted them was not, in general, considered data. The conversation that decided her future occurred in the drawing room on a Saturday evening in early May, while Milly was upstairs at her writing desk, composing a letter to her school friend Clara in Carlisle. The letter was about nothing of consequence. A botanical sketch she had made of the crocuses at the bottom of the garden, a book she had borrowed from the library, and she was in the pleasant, suspended state of someone engaged in the comfortable work of correspondence, which is to say she was not thinking about anything that mattered, which is often when things that matter are decided about you. She heard the drawing-room door close. She heard the low tenor of men's voices, her father and Lewis White, the latter's voice slightly more resonant, slightly more measured. She heard the clink of the whiskey decanter. She did not hear what was said, and she did not go downstairs to ask. An hour later, her mother appeared in the doorway of her room with an expression that combined nervous excitement and rehearsed calm in a proportion that Milly recognized immediately as significant. Margaret Fielding sat on the edge of Milly's bed, arranged her skirts, and began to speak in the bright, rapid manner of someone who has prepared a speech and is now delivering it slightly faster than planned. Lewis White was a man of excellent standing. He had substantial property in Yorkshire and a townhouse in London. He had, her mother said, spoken to her father that evening with great sincerity regarding his intentions toward Milly, and her father had found him. Here her mother paused, searching for the right word, thorough. Which meant, her father had indicated, that Lewis White intended to be a thorough provider, and that the settlement he had proposed was, and here her mother lowered her voice, as if the figure were too large for a normal tone, really quite remarkable. Milly put down her pen. "Has he asked me anything?" she said. Her mother blinked. "He has spoken to your father?" "Yes." Milly looked at the half-finished letter on her desk. "But he hasn't asked me." Her mother's expression cycled through several things quickly, a brief flash of something that might have been sympathy, then the resolute composure of a woman who has decided that impracticality is a luxury they cannot afford. "Milly, my dear, men of his standing speak to fathers. It is the done thing. There is nothing unusual in it." "I know it isn't unusual," Milly said. And she did know. She simply noted it. Her mother took her hands. "He is good, Milly. He is steady. He will give you a life that—" And here she stopped, and her voice became, briefly, something other than her speech, something more tired, and more honest. He will give you a life with no holes in it. Do you understand? Milly looked at her mother's hands, which were thin and slightly reddened at the knuckles from the cold, and which had done most of the mending and most of the managing for as long as Milly could remember. She understood. She said yes the following afternoon, to Lewis White, in the front parlour, on the rug that was turned to conceal the threadbare patch. He thanked her with the grave courtesy of a man who has gotten what he came for. He did not say he loved her. She had not expected him to. She told herself that this was fine. She told herself that love, in any case, was something built over time, not declared at the start. She told herself that she would learn to know him, and he would learn to know her, and that out of knowing, something like warmth might eventually grow. She was not wrong, exactly. She was simply wrong about what would grow instead. The wedding took place on a Thursday in September, at the church in Milly's home parish, and it was beautiful in the way that well-funded events are beautiful, everything correct, everything chosen, everything arranged so that the occasion occupied the senses completely and left no space for the mind to wander toward questions that had not yet formed themselves fully enough to ask. Lewis wore a dark suit of impeccable cut. He stood at the altar with the calm of a man for whom this was a significant occasion rather than an overwhelming one, and when Milly walked toward him on her father's arm, he watched her with an expression that she could only describe as proprietary, though she would not find that word for some time, and by the time she did, she would have found many others first. The reception was held at the White estate in Yorkshire, which Milly saw for the first time through the carriage window on the journey north and which was, she thought, trying very hard to be impressive. It succeeded. The house sat at the end of a gravel drive lined with horse chestnuts, 3 stories of pale limestone with tall windows that caught the late September light, and grounds that spoke of a wealth old enough to be casual about itself. It was, by any reasonable measure, a handsome property. It was also, as she would learn, a property that had a way of making the outside world feel very far away. The honeymoon month passed in a kind of arranged pleasantness. Lewis was attentive, formal, occasionally warm in the way of a man who has decided that warmth is an appropriate feature of a recently concluded courtship and who continues to deploy it out of professional habit. He showed her the house room by room with the air of a guide conducting a valued tour. He introduced her to the key members of the household staff, the butler, the cook, and one new young housemaid, Tilly Hancock, a girl of perhaps 17 with a quick, quiet intelligence behind her eyes, and he explained, in each case, the proper manner of addressing and managing them. He had opinions about management. He shared them frequently and at length, and with the confidence of a man who has never been contradicted on a subject by anyone who mattered. The household, he explained, ran on order. Each member of the staff had a defined role and a defined sphere of operation, and confusion arose. He used the word confusion the way other men use the word catastrophe, when those spheres were not respected. I have found, he said pleasantly, one evening at supper, that a household in which a wife maintains a consistent and correct relationship with the staff is a household in which difficulties rarely arise. Milly said that she agreed, because she did, broadly, and also because she had not yet learned to identify which of Lewis's pleasant observations contained a second meaning. This one meant, you will not speak to the servants familiarly. You will not ask them about their lives. You will not invite confidences or offer them. You will maintain the proper distance. She did not know this yet. She learned it 3 weeks later, when she stopped to ask Thomas Howells, the groundskeeper, how his mother was. She had heard from the cook that the woman had been unwell, and Lewis, who had appeared at the garden door at a moment that she later understood was not accidental, had waited until Thomas had gone before speaking to her. His voice was pleasant. His face was pleasant. He explained, pleasantly, that certain conversations with outdoor staff were not appropriate for the lady of the house, and that he trusted she understood. She understood. She began, without deciding to understand more things. The rules did not arrive all at once. That was, she would later think, their particular cruelty. They accumulated the way that cold accumulates in a room from which the fire has been gradually removed, so that each individual reduction in warmth is barely noticeable and the eventual freezing arrives as a kind of surprise. There were rooms she was not to enter without reason: his study, the lower library, the north wing of the second floor where he kept his papers. There was correspondence she was not to send without his review, a restriction he framed as a convenience. He had a secretary who handled correspondence efficiently and could ensure that letters were properly dispatched. There were callers she was not to receive if he was absent from the house. There were social engagements she attended and social engagements she did not attend, The distinction between them unclear to her until she understood that the ones she did not attend were those where she might speak with people he had not pre-assessed. She was not without resources. She had her books, her writing, the garden in good weather. She had, in the early months, enough small freedoms that the restrictions did not feel like restrictions so much as the parameters of a new life that had simply not yet fully opened up to her. She told herself that marriage required adjustment. Her mother had told her this. The rector at home had told her this. She had no particular reason to doubt it. The first time it happened was in November. She had written a letter, a brief, ordinary letter to her friend Clara in Carlisle, describing the house, describing the winter coming in across the Yorkshire landscape, asking after Clara's family. She had not thought to show it to Lewis. She had not thought to show it to Lewis because it had not occurred to her that she needed to, because it was a letter to a friend, because she had been writing letters to Clara since she was 14 years old. Lewis found the letter on her writing desk, sealed but not yet given to the post. He brought it to supper and placed it beside her plate without comment and ate his first course before, in a very quiet voice, asking her why she had not mentioned that she was corresponding. She explained that it was a letter to Clara. She said it as though this were an explanation, because she believed it was. Lewis put down his fork. He looked at her with the calm, precise attention of a man who is explaining something to someone who has failed to grasp it. She could not have said, afterward, exactly what he said. The words were not raised. They were not obscene. They were, she searched, later, for the right description and found it finally in the word surgical. Each sentence made a small, deliberate incision in some part of her self-possession. He addressed her intelligence, her judgment, her understanding of what marriage required, and he did it all in the tone of a man who was, above all, disappointed. Which was, she would come to understand, a tone he kept carefully maintained because it was so much more effective than anger. When supper ended, he took the letter. She did not know whether he sent it. She never heard from Clara again, and she did not write. She sat at her writing desk that night for a long time, not writing anything. The room was warm. The lamp was lit. Outside, the Yorkshire night pressed against the glass. She told herself that she had made an error. She told herself that she would be more careful. She told herself many reasonable things, and none of them were wrong, and none of them reached the thing that had happened, which was not a misunderstanding, and which she could not yet name. Tilly Hancock was 17 and quick and observed the house with the total peripheral attention of someone who has learned that watching without appearing to watch is a survival skill. She had been in service for 2 years already, at a smaller house in the village, before Mr. White had engaged her on the recommendation of the previous employer, and she had arrived at the White estate with a reasonable professional ambition of learning her trade and keeping her place. She kept her place. She also kept her eyes open. She saw things. She noted them in the private ledger of her mind with no particular agenda, simply because she was the kind of person who noticed things, and things, once noticed, tend to stay. She noticed that Mrs. White wore high-collared gowns even in the warmth of the house. She noticed that Mrs. White sometimes moved with a care, a very slight, very controlled care, that suggested she was managing pain that she had decided no one was to observe. She noticed that Mrs. White's face, which was an expressive face by nature, had developed a quality of deliberate blankness that had not been there when she first arrived, and which Tilly, who was young and had no formal framework for understanding what she was seeing, understood instinctively as armor. It was in February, 3 months after the wedding, that Tilly understood fully. She had gone to the mistress's dressing room with fresh linens and had knocked and, receiving no answer, had opened the door quietly in the manner of a housemaid who has learned that sometimes people are simply elsewhere. Mrs. White was at the dressing table, and she had not heard the knock, and she was doing up the buttons at the back of her collar with the rapid efficiency of someone who has learned to do this without assistance. The dress was not fully fastened. Tilly saw her back. She stood very still in the doorway. Mrs. White heard her then and turned, and the two of them were still for a moment, the girl in the doorway with the linens, the woman at the mirror with the buttons undone, in a silence that held more information than either of them was prepared to arrange into sentences. Then Millie White turned back to the mirror and said, quietly and without inflection, "The buttons at the top are awkward. Would you mind?" Tilly crossed the room and did up the buttons without speaking. She worked carefully. When she finished, she smoothed the collar flat with a gesture that was, she was not sure why, gentler than it needed to be, and stepped back. "Thank you," Mrs. White said. "Of course, Tilly said. She took the old linens from the bed and left the room and went to the linen cupboard on the upper landing and stood there for a moment in the close smell of clean cotton and lavender and let herself feel, briefly and privately, what she felt. Then she closed the cupboard door and went downstairs to her next task. She was 17. She did not know what to do. She would help where she could. She told no one. 2 years into her marriage, Millicent White had become an expert in the architecture of silence. She knew which silences were safe. The silence of Lewis reading his papers at breakfast, the silence of an evening in which nothing had gone wrong, the silence of a house in which the servants had all retired and the night was ordinary. She knew which silences were not. The silence that followed a supper in which he had looked at her a particular way, the silence of his footsteps pausing outside a closed door, the silence after a question asked in the wrong tone. She had also become an expert in another kind of architecture, the architecture of concealment. She knew precisely how to arrange a shawl, how to sit, how to stand when introduced to visitors so that the line of her collar remained undisturbed. She had developed a wardrobe of high-neck gowns in dark fabrics that the dressmaker in Harrogate had commented upon as very fashionably severe, and Millie had thanked her pleasantly and ordered 2 more. She had not stopped thinking about escape. She had simply, carefully, systematically investigated it, and found each avenue closed. The letter to her mother had taken her 3 weeks to compose. Not for want of words. She had words in abundance. She had been composing them in her head at night when Lewis was asleep, rearranging them, removing anything that could not survive the journey unexamined. She knew by now that correspondence from the house passed through channels she could not fully trust, but she had found, in a conversation with the grocer's boy who came on Tuesdays, that letters could sometimes be carried separately from the usual post if one had the right coin. She was careful about coins, but she had small amounts from what was permitted for household incidentals, and she spent one now. The letter she sent was a model of strategic honesty. She did not write of violence. She wrote of unhappiness in terms that she believed her mother would understand. The isolation, the restrictions, the sense of living inside a set of rules she had not agreed to and could not revise. She described the high-collared gowns not at all. She described, instead, the feeling of being in a cage that no one else could see. She asked her mother whether she might visit, alone, without Lewis, for a week in the summer. She framed it as a health matter, her nerves, the benefit of Cumberland air. Her mother's reply arrived in 11 days. It was warm. It was long. It was, in its entirety, beside the point. Margaret Fielding wrote of the adjustments that all marriages required. She wrote of Lewis's excellent reputation, which was a fact that she seemed to consider relevant to the question of whether her daughter was unhappy. She wrote of the importance of patience, of the virtue of finding one's place within a household and allowing that place to become, over time, comfortable. She wrote of her own first years of marriage, which had also been difficult, though she did not specify how, and she appeared to consider this equivalence a form of reassurance. At the end of the letter, almost as an afterthought, she mentioned that a summer visit might be complicated given Lewis's busy schedule, and suggested that perhaps next spring, if things were settled. Next spring. Millie read the letter twice, then a third time, as if rereading might locate some content she had initially missed. It did not. She burned it in the grate, which was the only privacy she was certain of. She did not write again. The church was her next recourse, and in this she was not without hope. The parish rector, the Reverend Aldous Mather, was a man in his 60s who had served the district for 30 years and who was considered, by the county's Protestant establishment, a man of genuine conscience. He preached on compassion with what seemed like sincerity. He visited the sick. He had, on one occasion, spoken publicly against the treatment of mill workers, which had cost him some goodwill among the local gentry and which he appeared to have found worth the cost. Millie attended Sunday service as she always did, and she was careful to take her place in the pew and to look exactly as she always looked, because Lewis attended also and sat beside her, and the business of Sunday service was one he considered important to their standing in the community. But on a Wednesday morning in March, when the church was empty and she had arranged, with some delicacy of scheduling, to be walking past it alone during the hour that the rector spent in preparation for his Thursday evening Bible study, she went in. Reverend Mather received her in the vestry with a courtesy due to the wife of a significant parish benefactor, which she was, Lewis having donated funds to the east window restoration the previous year. She sat across from him and she told him, carefully, that she was experiencing difficulties in her marriage that she did not know how to address. She said that these difficulties were serious. She did not say the word violence. She had considered this and decided that precision might, paradoxically, be less believable than implication, and that implication was in any case all she could risk. The rector listened. He folded his hands. When she had finished, he was quiet for a moment, and she felt, briefly, the possibility of being heard. Then he spoke. He spoke of the difficulty of marriage. He spoke of the weight of vows, and the particular weight of those taken before God, which were not to be set aside in times of hardship but were rather the framework within which hardship was to be endured and, through endurance, overcome. He spoke of prayer as the first recourse in marital trouble, and of wifely patience as the virtue most likely to create conditions in which a husband's better nature might emerge. He spoke of the dignity of suffering borne with grace. He did not, at any point, ask her to be more specific about what was happening in her home. She looked at him and understood, with a clarity that was not bitter. She was past bitterness, which requires a kind of hope in order to function, that he was not going to help her. Not because he was a cruel man. He was, she believed, a man of genuine faith and genuine intention. But his faith operated within a set of social arrangements that depended on the inviolability of the domestic sphere, and she was asking him to see inside that sphere, and he had decided, kindly, regretfully, but absolutely, that he would not. She thanked him for his time and walked home along the road beside the field wall, in the grey March morning, and she did not pray because she had tried that already and found it, like most recourses she had attempted, inadequate to the actual problem. The constable's name was P.C. Hodge, and she had seen him twice at public events, the county fete, and once at the station when she had waited for the train that brought Lewis's brother for a Christmas visit. He was a large, competent-looking man with a moustache and the air of someone who took his responsibilities seriously, and she had thought about him, in the way that one thinks about the nearest exit in an unfamiliar building, at intervals over the preceding months. The occasion arose at the summer agricultural show, which Lewis attended every year because it was the kind of public engagement that confirmed his standing as a man of the county. He moved through the event with the ease of someone in his natural habitat, pressing flesh, admiring livestock, accepting compliments about the quality of his property and the grace of his wife with equal, managed pleasure. Milly moved with him, which was the arrangement. She saw P.C. Hodge at the edge of the main enclosure, standing at a slight remove from the crowd in the manner of someone attending to public order. She mapped the distance between herself and Lewis. He was 15 feet away, turned in conversation with a cattle farmer, and she calculated, as she had learned to calculate all things, the window. She took 3 steps toward the constable. Lewis appeared at her side. Not rushing. Not dramatically. Simply there, as if he had always intended to be standing where she was walking. Mrs. White. He said her name pleasantly, as he always said everything, and offered his arm. She took it. P.C. Hodge glanced in their direction, saw a gentleman and his wife, tipped his hat in polite acknowledgement, and looked elsewhere. Tilly helped her for the first time with full knowledge in the autumn of 1869, when Milly came down to breakfast on a morning after a night she would not have wanted to describe and found, in Tilly's quiet, matter-of-fact gaze, the recognition of someone who already knew. Tilly had fetched a clean cloth and the small bottle of witch hazel that was kept in the kitchen cupboard for general household use, and she had, without being asked and without speaking, helped Milly arrange her collar and smooth the evidence away from what could be seen, and then had gone back to her work as if she had done nothing of significance. It was the most practical kindness anyone had shown Milly in 2 years. She sat at the breakfast table and she thought, with the cool, dry clarity that comes after a night in which feeling has been entirely spent, that this was what she had, a housemaid's silence and a bottle of witch hazel. She resolved, in the same moment, to stop looking for a door that other people would open for her. The doors, she had determined, were not available. The only question that remained was what she would do about it. She had spoken to Thomas Howells in the garden. This was the fact at the center of the evening, the stone around which everything else would crystallize. She had been cutting back the last of the autumn roses, a task she had claimed from the garden staff over the years simply because the garden was one of the few places she could be without Lewis immediately present, and Thomas had been raking leaves from the far end of the path, and she had asked him, without thinking, how the drive from the village had been that morning, because the morning had been frosty and Thomas was not young and she had thought about his knees on the frozen road. It was a question of 7 or 8 words. It was the kind of question that one person might ask another without any significance beyond the ordinary human interest in whether another person is cold. Lewis had been at the upper window. She did not know he was there. She found out that evening. He came to her dressing room at 9:30. She was at the small table near the window where she sometimes read in the evenings, and she heard his step on the stair and felt the change in the quality of the air that she had learned to read over 6 years with the precision of a barometer, the particular pressure that preceded a storm of this kind. She put down her book and turned to face the door before it opened, because she had learned that it was better to be already facing a thing than to be caught looking away from it. He entered without knocking. He closed the door behind him. His voice, when he spoke, was very quiet and very even, and this was the most frightening version of Lewis White, not shouting, not disordered, but precise, calibrated, the violence of a man who has never lost control because control is itself the weapon. He spoke about Thomas Howells. He spoke about the conversation he had witnessed from the window. He spoke about the appropriate limits of the mistress's relationship with the outdoor staff, as he had addressed this matter before, as she apparently required reminding, as her persistent failure to understand the correct boundaries of her position in this household was a source of considerable embarrassment to him, as she might pause to consider what that embarrassment cost a man of his position, as she stood. This was not a decision. Her body made it, because the table was between her and the wall, and when he crossed the room toward her, the only direction not blocked was up, and she took it. He stopped 3 feet from her. The room was very quiet. The lamp on the table made warm shapes on the ceiling. Outside, somewhere, an owl. He said something else, and she did not hear the words, because she was looking at his face and she was reading it, as she had learned to read it over 6 years, and what she read was different tonight. There was something behind the precision. Something that was not the usual cold efficiency but was instead, she searched for it, found it, felt the recognition go through her like cold water, something that had decided that tonight would be different. That tonight the usual careful geography, nothing above the collar, nothing visible to the world, would not constrain him. She understood this with her body before her mind caught up. She understood it in the way that animals understand weather, not as information but as certainty. She was going to die in this room. Not as a possibility. As a fact that had not yet arrived but was already in the room, already at a certain fixed distance from the present moment, closing. He moved toward her and she moved back and her legs met the work table behind her, the small table she used for correspondence, which she no longer used for correspondence but which was still positioned where she had positioned it years ago, in a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. And her hand went back, instinctively, to find the table's surface, and her fingers encountered cold metal. The letter opener was silver, 8 inches long, with a handle shaped like a folded wing. She had owned it since before her marriage. She had brought it from her parents' house in Cumberland, where she had used it to open letters from friends she was no longer permitted to correspond with. Her fingers closed around it. What happened next occupied a space of perhaps 3 seconds that she would spend the rest of her life being unable to recall precisely. She could recall the cold of the metal. She could recall the sound of his breath very close and the particular quality of his hands. She could recall the moment when her arm moved, not as a decision but as a reflex, the body choosing what the mind had not yet formed into a question. Then the sound of the door downstairs, the constable's voices, the boots on the stair. A neighbor in the adjacent property had heard the household and sent for help, which was an accident of geography that Millie would spend years understanding was not something she could have planned. Lewis was on the floor. The letter opener was in her hand. She did not move. She was not certain she was capable of moving. She stood at the work table with a letter opener in her right hand and she looked at Lewis White on the floor, and she was aware of her own breath and of the lamp still burning and of the owl somewhere in the dark outside, and she was not, precisely, thinking anything. The door broke open. There were 2 constables. They looked at Lewis. They looked at Millie. They looked at the letter opener. One of them said her name. She said, yes, because that was her name, and she put the letter opener down on the table, and she did not resist when they took her arms, because resistance seemed, at that moment, a concept from a different life. They took her out through the door and down the stair and out into the November night, and she was wearing her dressing gown and no coat, and the air was very cold and smelled of frost and wood smoke, and she looked back once at the lit window of the study on the upper floor, the amber rectangle of it in the dark stone face of the house, and then she did not look back again. The constable asked if she was cold. She said she did not know. The lower corridors of Whitmore Prison smelled of damp stone and carbolic acid, and they were lit by gas brackets set at intervals that suggested a preference for economy over visibility. Wilson Alexander walked them with his hands clasped behind his back, which was his customary posture when he was thinking about something he did not yet fully understand. He had slept 4 hours. He had spent 2 of the preceding night's remaining hours reviewing the trial transcript, which he had sent for immediately upon returning to his office following the suspended execution. He had spent another hour reading the physical evidence inventory from the case file. He had spent the final hour in the particular, unproductive state of a man who has found an inconsistency and cannot, yet, locate its source. The trial had been procedurally sound. The jury had heard evidence. The verdict had been delivered correctly. Every step of the process, from arrest to conviction to sentencing, had been executed with the thoroughness that the law required. And yet, the back of the condemned woman told a story that the trial had never told, and Wilson, who respected procedure deeply and the truth slightly more, was finding this gap increasingly difficult to accommodate. He found Dr. Declan Burke in a small office at the end of the lower corridor, a man of perhaps 50, broad across the shoulders, with grey-streaked hair cropped short and the hands of someone accustomed to practical rather than theoretical medicine. His desk was covered in files and medical texts and one very old coffee cup that suggested he had been working long enough to stop noticing it. Burke looked up without standing. He had the quality, Wilson noted, of a man who has been around enough authority to respect it without being dominated by it. "Your Grace," he said. "The prisoner has been prepared for examination, as requested." "Good," Wilson said. "I will observe." Burke regarded him for a moment. "It will not be a brief examination." "I don't require it to be brief. I require it to be thorough." Burke nodded once, which appeared to satisfy him, and rose. Millie White was brought to the examination room by a wardress, a plain, low-ceilinged room with a deal table and a gas lamp mounted too high to be entirely useful. She entered the room with the same quality of controlled steadiness she had brought to the courtyard, and she stopped when she saw Wilson standing against the far wall. Something moved across her face, too quickly to categorize, and then it was gone, replaced by the careful blankness he was coming to recognize as her primary mode of expression. She sat where she was directed to sit. Burke explained the examination to her in plain terms. She listened without visible reaction and answered his preliminary questions in monosyllables. Yes, she was Millicent White. Yes, she understood what was being asked. Yes, she would cooperate. She spoke like a woman who has used so much energy managing other people's responses that she has none remaining to manage her own. When Burke asked her to indicate the extent of the injury she had sustained during her marriage, she stood up, turned away from both men without ceremony, and unfastened the buttons at her collar. Wilson looked away, then, after a moment, looked back. Burke conducted his examination in silence, broken only by the occasional note he made in the open file beside him. He was methodical. He moved systematically across the visible surface of the evidence with the careful attention of a man who understands that what he is looking at is a document, and the documents must be read correctly. When he had finished, he helped Millie refasten the buttons and he thanked her for her cooperation in the flat, precise tone of a professional who understands that medical courtesy is not the same as emotional acknowledgement, and she was returned to her cell. Then Burke picked up his file and turned to Wilson. "What I can tell you with medical certainty," Burke said, settling back into his chair and spreading the file on the desk between them, "is this. The injuries I have documented span a period of not less than 5 years, and possibly longer. I identify 4 distinct categories of wound, distinguished by age, method, and depth." He spoke precisely and without embellishment, and Wilson listened. The oldest injuries had healed into the skin as true scars, depressed, pale, smoothed by time. They were consistent with a repeated, targeted application of a narrow implement to specific regions of the back and upper torso. Newer injuries showed less complete healing. Several were still in intermediate stages of resolution. One, Burke noted, was only a few months old. "The placement," Burke said, "is consistent and deliberate. Nothing above the collar line. Nothing below the wrist. The visible surfaces of the body, face, neck, hands, forearms, are entirely unmarked. The regions that are marked are precisely those that can be covered by clothing." Wilson said nothing. "This is not the pattern of incidents," Burke continued. "Incidents are random, they fall where they fall. This pattern is the result of systematic intention. Someone made decisions, over a period of years, about where and how these injuries would be placed so that they would not be seen." He paused. "In my professional opinion, Mrs. White did not kill her husband in a moment of passion arising from a brief quarrel. She survived 6 years of methodical torture and killed him in the moment he gave her reasonable cause to believe her life was in immediate danger." The gas lamp made a small sound, adjusting to some shift in pressure in the line. Wilson said, "Those are conclusions that go beyond the scope of physical evidence." "They are conclusions," Burke said, "that are supported entirely by the physical evidence, interpreted by someone who knows what they're looking at." He folded his hands on the file. "Your Grace, you nearly hanged a woman this morning who, in my medical opinion, was defending her life. That is what I can tell you with certainty. What you do with it is your affair." Wilson looked at the file. He looked at Burke, who had the expression of a man who has said what he came to say and will not be improved upon by elaboration. "I need witnesses," Wilson said. "People who were in or around that household." "You'll want the groundskeeper," Burke said. "And there was a housemaid. She left the service some years ago." He glanced at a note in the margin of his file. "Tilly Hancock. She's in service elsewhere now. I understand it took some doing to trace her, but the court's investigator found an address." Wilson stood. "Thank you, Dr. Burke." Burke looked up. "Do not thank me. Get it right." Wilson pulled on his coat and went out into the dim corridor, and walked back toward the light with the measured, purposeful step of a man who has decided that the procedure he is engaged in is not the conclusion of a case but the beginning of a proper one. The estate looked different in February than it had in the accounts and the trial records, which described it with the formal efficiency of legal language: a property of 3 stories, extensive grounds, located 4 miles from the village of, and so forth. In legal language, a house is a structure. Standing in the drive in a February wind with the horse chestnuts bare above him and the gravel grey beneath him and the windows of the house empty and dark because no one lived there now and no one had since November, Wilson Alexander found it was something else. A place that had held a life, and had held it very still. He had written ahead. Thomas Howells, who still maintained the grounds under temporary arrangement with the estate solicitor, was waiting for him in the kitchen garden at the back of the house, raking the edge of a bed with the automatic dedication of someone who has learned that work is the most reliable thing available. He was a man of perhaps 60, compact and weathered, with the deliberate economy of movement that comes from a lifetime of outdoor labor. He did not stop raking when Wilson arrived. He simply acknowledged him with a nod and then kept working, which Wilson took not as discourtesy but as the particular defiance of a man who is about to tell something he is not proud of, and who finds it easier to speak while his hands are occupied. Wilson stood at the edge of the kitchen garden and waited. "You want to know what I saw," Thomas said, after a silence that was not uncomfortable, in the way that silences are not uncomfortable when both people in them know what they're for. "Yes." Thomas raked a long stroke. "I saw enough." "Tell me." Thomas Howells had worked the White Estate grounds for 11 years, since before Mr. White had acquired the property, since the previous owner's time. He had stayed on because the grounds were good grounds and he knew them, and because finding work at his age was not a simple business, and because he had, in the beginning, no particular reason to believe that the new owner's personal arrangements were any of his concern. He had revised this position. He described what he had seen, and he described it in the flat, particular detail of a man who has rehearsed the telling many times in the year since it happened, not for anyone else, but in the repeated private conversation that guilt conducts with itself at 3 in the morning when sleep will not come. He had seen bruises. Not once but several times, across 4 or 5 years. Mrs. White in the kitchen garden, or at the edge of the south lawn, in moments when the angle of the sun or the position of her arm had revealed what her clothing was designed to conceal. He had seen her in the garden in winter, at hours when there was no reason for a lady to be out of doors, in a coat but without gloves, walking in the dark at a pace that suggested she needed to be moving rather than that she needed to be anywhere specific. He had heard sounds, once, from the upper floor of the house, on an evening when he had been late finishing the cutting back of the pergola. "What kind of sounds?" Wilson asked. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "The kind that you keep walking from." He stopped raking. He held the rake handle and looked at the bare bed and Wilson let him look. "I kept walking," Thomas said. "Every time. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself I didn't know for certain. I told myself." He stopped. He started again. "She asked after my mother once. My mother had been ill, and Mrs. White had heard, from the cook I think, and she came out to the garden one afternoon when Mr. White was in Harrogate and she asked how my mother was getting on. Just that. Just asking." He looked at Wilson. His eyes were dry. Whatever grief he carried had been lived with long enough that it had become part of the structure. "Nobody else in that house asked after my mother," he said. "In 11 years. Wilson wrote this down. Thomas talked for another half-hour. He was thorough. He was honest about the gaps, the things he had not seen, the interpretations he was uncertain of, but he was also honest about what he had seen and the interpretations he was now certain of, and Wilson believed him. Which was not a thing Wilson extended easily but which, in this case, he had no difficulty finding grounds for. When they were finished, Thomas picked up his rake and looked at the house. "Did she do wrong?" he said. He was not asking Wilson's legal opinion. He was asking something else. "She survived," Wilson said. Thomas nodded once. Then he went back to raking. Tilly Hancock was 23 now, and in service at a mill owner's household on the edge of Bradford, a large, comfortable house with 3 other maids and a housekeeper who was strict but fair, and an employer who shouted occasionally about business matters but never came near the servants' quarters, which was, Tilly had decided, the most important quality a new position could have. She had known Wilson was coming. He had written ahead, as he had written to Thomas, and she had received the letter and read it and put it away in her trunk and thought about it for 3 days before telling the housekeeper that she had a personal matter to attend to on her half-day Thursday and would need to receive a visitor in the small sitting room normally reserved for the upper servants' use. She was waiting when Wilson arrived. She did not offer him tea, which was a small indication of how the conversation was going to be conducted, and she did not sit in the deferential posture that women in service typically adopted in the presence of a duke of the realm. She sat straight, with her hands in her lap, and she looked at him with the dark, assessing gaze of someone who has decided that if this interview is to be useful, it is going to require honesty rather than performance. Wilson recognized the quality and adjusted himself accordingly. "You know why I'm here," he said. "Yes." "Tell me what you know about the White household." "Take your time." She did not take her time. She had taken it already, over 5 years of private accounting, and what she had for him was ready. She had helped Millie White conceal the marks of her husband's attentions on 14 separate occasions, she said. Not estimate. Not approximately. 14, because she had counted them, not at the time but afterward, when counting was the only way she could make herself understand the scope of what she had been a witness to. She described each incident with the precision of a woman who has decided that vagueness is a form of complicity. She described the witch hazel and the careful arrangement of collars. She described the mornings when Mrs. White did not come down to breakfast. She described the way the household learned, without being told, to perform normalcy around an event that everyone peripherally knew had occurred the previous evening. "Did you speak to her about it?" Wilson asked. "No. Why not?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because I was afraid. Because I was in service in his house and I had no standing to speak, and he had every standing to dismiss me without a character reference, and a housemaid without a character reference is a housemaid without a position, which is a woman without an income. Which is," she stopped. "I was afraid," she said again, simply. "I helped where I could and I was afraid of everything else." "You left," Wilson said. "I left in 1871, 2 years before it happened." She looked at her hands. "I thought I couldn't bear to stay. I know now that I should have stayed and borne it, because bearing it would have meant being a witness. I chose to stop witnessing instead." She paused. "I thought that was the brave thing. Getting out of a situation that was doing me harm to watch." Her voice was entirely even. "I understand now that it was the easy thing." "You were a young woman in a difficult position," Wilson said. "So was she," Tilly said. "And she didn't leave." Wilson wrote in his notebook. The only sound was the scratch of the pen. "Is there anything else?" he asked. "Yes." She reached into the pocket of her apron and produced a small folded paper. "I had her write down one of her letters, a long time ago. She dictated it to me and I wrote it in my hand and kept it, because I don't know what I thought. I thought it might be needed someday." Wilson took the paper and unfolded it. The handwriting was rounded and careful, the hand of a young woman who had been educated plainly but thoroughly, and the letter was addressed to no one and described, in measured, controlled language, a night in the winter of 1869, with dates and details and the kind of specific, particular truth that cannot be invented. He folded it and placed it in his coat pocket. "Thank you, Miss Hancock," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Exonerate her," she said. It was not a request. He stood. He put on his hat. He walked back to his carriage through the Bradford afternoon, and as he rode back toward Whitmore, he reviewed his notes, and the note said what he had known since the courtyard but had needed witnesses to prove. that a woman had been tortured for 6 years in plain sight of a community that had decided, collectively and individually, not to see it, and that the law had very nearly completed the process. Social pressure, Wilson had observed over the course of his career, operates most effectively not through direct confrontation but through the management of occasion. Direct confrontation can be refused. Occasion must be navigated. Lady Amy Andrews arranged her occasion with considerable skill. She hosted a luncheon, small, distinguished, ostensibly a gathering of county figures interested in the establishment of a new reading room in Harrogate, to which Wilson had been invited because his title gave the proceedings a gravity that the initiative required and because Lady Andrews was a woman who understood how to use an invitation. Wilson knew this and attended anyway, because the alternative was to appear to be avoiding her, which would have confirmed a weakness he did not have. She received him in the pale drawing room of a Harrogate house, which had been decorated in a manner that suggested she regarded beauty as a civic obligation, and she made the introduction to Mrs. Abby Burgess, a woman of perhaps 45 with a precise, composed face of someone who has decided that composure is indistinguishable from correctness and who has maintained this position for so long that she may have begun to believe it. They discussed the reading room for 30 minutes. Wilson offered his support in the measured terms that such offers require. The luncheon was served and was excellent, and the conversation was entirely about everything except what the occasion was actually for. Then the other guests departed, with a convenient timing that suggested they had been arranged to depart, and Wilson found himself in the pale drawing room with Lady Andrews and Mrs. Burgess and the good china still on the table between them, and Lady Andrews's manner underwent the small, subtle shift of a woman who has been waiting to have the real conversation. "Your Grace," she said, pouring tea with the ease of someone who has long understood that actions performed gracefully appear less aggressive than they are. "We appreciate your attending. We wanted the opportunity to speak with you privately about a matter of some concern." "By all means," Wilson said. Lady Andrews spoke well. Wilson gave her that. She was not a stupid woman, and her argument was not a stupid argument. It was, in fact, a sophisticated one, and it deserved to be engaged with rather than dismissed. She did not, she said, deny that the white marriage may have contained difficulties. She did not, she said, pretend that domestic life was uniformly harmonious among even the most respectable households. But the matter had been properly tried. The jury had considered the evidence available to them, and this was the key phrase, she said it twice. The evidence available to them, not evidence suppressed or distorted but evidence as it existed at the time of the trial, and they had delivered a verdict. To reopen that verdict, she said, on the basis of an examination conducted after conviction, conducted by a prison physician whose conclusions were shaped by his proximity to the condemned, this was not justice. This was sentiment dressed in the language of procedure. And the danger of sentiment dressed in procedure was that it created precedent. Any wife, in any marriage that had gone badly, might subsequently claim retrospective grievance and use that claim to place herself above the law that governed everyone. "The law is only as strong," Lady Andrews said, with the conviction of someone who has prepared this sentence, as its capacity to be consistently applied. "Due process protects us all, Your Grace, including those who are no longer with us to speak for themselves." Mrs. Burgess said nothing. She did not need to. Her expression of grave agreement did the work. Wilson looked at Lady Andrews. He looked at his tea. He set the cup down on the saucer with the care of a man who is selecting his response from several available options. "Lady Andrews," he said, "I am sensible of your concern for the integrity of the process. And you are correct that due process exists to protect everyone, including the deceased." He paused. "It also exists to protect the living from the consequences of a process that was never given adequate information. If the evidence available at trial was incomplete, not suppressed, not distorted, but incomplete, then the verdict produced from that incomplete evidence is not the verdict that due process requires. It is the verdict that incomplete information produces. These are not the same thing." Lady Andrews opened her mouth. "I have not concluded my inquiry," Wilson said pleasantly. "When I have, I will act in accordance with what the evidence shows. I trust that is what you are asking for." He thanked them for the luncheon, which had been, he said, excellent. He made his farewells with perfect courtesy, and he left the pale drawing room, and he was in his carriage and 2 miles from Harrogate before he allowed himself to consider how close he had come to the edge of what he was permitted to do without the protection of further evidence. He needed the ledger. He had been told it might exist, in the notes from the original investigation, A passing reference by one of the constables who had attended the scene to a leather-bound book found in the study desk that had been catalogued in the evidence inventory and then, in the chaos of the trial's primary focus on the murder itself, had not been submitted as evidence because no one had understood what it was. Wilson had requested it from the evidence stores that morning before the luncheon. It was waiting for him at his hotel. The ledger was small, perhaps 6 inches by 4, in brown calfskin with a brass clasp. Lewis White's name was not on the cover or the spine, but his handwriting was on every page, the same steady, meticulous hand that appeared in his correspondence, his business accounts, his public letters, applied here to a different kind of record-keeping. 41 entries, spanning from November 1867 to August 1873. Each dated, each brief, each describing, in the neutral language of administration, an incident, the infraction that had prompted it, the nature of the response, and, in several cases, a brief evaluation of its efficacy. Wilson read the first entry. November 12, 1867. Mrs. W. sent correspondence without review. Matter addressed. Letter destroyed. Correction applied, lower back, one occasion. Note for future. Review correspondence arrangement more thoroughly. He read the second. And the third. He read all 41. The language did not vary. It was the language of a man keeping business records. It was the language of a man who had categorized the systematic torture of another person as a management function, who had tracked it the way one tracks expenditures or staff performance, who had found nothing in his own actions that required concealment beyond the physical concealment of their effects. Wilson sat for a long time in the hotel chair with the closed ledger in his hands. The fire had burned down to embers. Outside, a carriage passed on the cobblestones and then the street was quiet. He thought about Lady Andrews's argument, which he had not dismissed because it was stupid. He had refused it because it was wrong. He thought about due process, which he had served for 23 years and which he believed in with the conviction of someone who has seen what happens when it is absent. And he thought about the particular quality of justice that requires, before everything else, that all the evidence be present, and what the law had done to Millicent White when it had tried her on less than half of the evidence available. He placed the ledger in his document case. He sat down at the writing desk and composed 3 letters. One to Magistrate Connor Fowler requesting the convening of a formal inquiry, one to the prison governor requesting that the condemned prisoner be maintained in her current status until the inquiry concluded, and one to Dr. Declan Burke requesting his formal testimony. He sealed and addressed each one. He did not sleep that night, but it was not an uncomfortable wakefulness. It was the wakefulness of a man who knows precisely what he intends to do and is waiting, with the patience of someone who has never found waiting difficult, for morning to arrive so that he can begin. The West Hall was not the largest courtroom in the county, but it had the quality of a room that had witnessed too many significant things to be entirely comfortable. A high ceiling of pale plaster, long windows through which the April light came in at an angle that illuminated dust and formality in equal measure, and rows of carved wooden benches that bore the accumulated weight of 2 centuries of legal proceedings with the dignity of something that has learned to be patient. It was full. This surprised Wilson, who had not anticipated public interest at this scale and who would not have welcomed it, but who recognized that it was not, in any sense, controllable. The nature of the case had reached the county papers. A convicted woman whose execution had been halted, a duke conducting an investigation, a family of reputation implicated in domestic allegations that society simultaneously found lurid and found convenient to doubt. It was, he noted with the dry clarity of someone who had learned not to be surprised by the relationship between suffering and spectacle, exactly the kind of thing that filled rooms. He sat to the left of the magistrate's bench and reviewed his notes and did not look at the gallery. Magistrate Connor Fowler arrived at 9 precisely, a man of 50-something with close-cropped white hair and the expression of someone who has spent 30 years hearing complex matters and has arrived at a productive peace with complexity. He arranged his papers, settled his glasses, and called the inquiry to order in the tone of a man who has no stake in the outcome except its accuracy. Millie White was brought in and seated at the respondent's bench. She wore a plain grey dress, her own this time, brought from her possessions by the prison wardress, and her hair was pinned simply. She sat without visible emotion and looked straight ahead, and the gallery produced a murmur that Fowler quieted with a single glance. The court recorder was a young man named Aldridge, who had the precise, efficient quality of someone who has trained himself to be a vehicle for information without being a filter for it. He read clearly. He read without emphasis, which was in some ways the most devastating way the ledger could have been read, not with horror or indignation, which the audience could have distanced themselves from, but with the flat institutional neutrality that Lewis White himself had deployed in the writing of it. 41 entries. Aldridge read them all. By the 10th, the gallery was entirely silent. Not the silence of boredom, but the silence of an audience that has had the conversational ground removed from beneath it. By the 20th, Wilson observed, from the corner of his eye, that several of the women in the gallery had ceased taking notes and had ceased, in fact, doing anything except listening. By the 30th, the silence had a quality that was no longer simply quiet but was the particular kind of loud that very large absences create. When Aldridge reached the 41st entry, August 15, 1873, 3 months before the night of Lewis White's death, and put the ledger down and closed it, no one in the gallery moved for a moment. Then someone coughed and the room returned to itself. Connor Fowler looked at the ledger and then at his notes and then at the gallery with the expression of someone taking a precise measurement. "We will proceed," he said. Dr. Burke gave his testimony with the efficiency of a man giving the same information for the second time to someone who now has the context to understand it. The physical evidence was corroborated by the ledger's entries, date for date, in the periods where both records overlapped. Burke's clinical assessment and Lewis White's administrative record told the same story in different vocabularies, which was about as complete a form of corroboration as evidence can produce. Thomas Howells gave his testimony with the compressed, careful honesty of a man who has decided that accuracy is the only form of penance available to him. He described what he had seen. He did not embellish. He described, also, the conversation about his mother. Just that, and he did not explain why he was including it, and Fowler did not ask him, because its relevance was evident to everyone in the room. Tilly Hancock gave hers last, of the witnesses, and she gave it looking directly at Fowler rather than at the gallery, because she had decided she was speaking to the law rather than to the room. 14 occasions. She described each one. She did not apologize. She did not contextualize. She provided the count and the details and let them sit. When Fowler asked her whether she believed Mrs. White had intended to kill her husband, Tilly was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I believe she intended to see the next morning." Fowler wrote this down. Then Millie White was called to the stand. She rose from the respondent's bench and crossed the floor with the same quiet steadiness she had brought to every public space she had occupied in the preceding months, and she sat in the witness box and folded her hands in her lap and looked at Fowler. She did not look at the gallery. She did not look at Lady Andrews, who was in the third row with a face so controlled it was almost a form of argument. She looked at Fowler and waited. Fowler's questions were precise and economical. He asked her to confirm the timeline of her marriage. She confirmed it. He asked her whether the ledger accurately reflected the incidents she had experienced. She said it reflected the ones he had recorded, and that there were others he had not recorded. He asked whether she could describe her state of mind on the night of November the 14th, 1873. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at her folded hands. Then she looked at Fowler. "I was not angry," she said. "I was not disordered. I was not in a state of passion." She paused. "I was certain. I was as certain as I have been of anything in my life, that if I did not act, I would not leave that room alive. I had reason for this certainty. 6 years of reason." She paused again. "I did not set out to commit a crime that night. I set out to survive it. I had managed to survive the preceding 6 years by other means. On that night, those means were not available to me." She looked at her hands once more, then up. "I did not intend to commit a crime," she said. "I merely intended to survive an abuser. And that night, I succeeded." The gallery was completely still. Fowler wrote. He looked at his notes. He looked at the ledger on the evidence table. He looked at Burke's testimony sheet and at Tilly Hancock, who was still in her seat, not looking at anyone in particular. Then he removed his glasses and cleaned them with the careful deliberation of a man who is allowing himself a moment to understand something fully before he acts upon it. He replaced his glasses. He looked at Millie White. "Mrs. White," he said, "this inquiry finds that the evidence presented at the original trial was materially incomplete, that the verdict produced from that incomplete evidence cannot be sustained, and that the evidence now before this inquiry demonstrates, on the balance of all available facts, that the actions taken by you on the night of the 14th of November, 1873, constitute a lawful act of self-preservation in the face of immediate and credible threat to your life." He set down his pen. "You're fully exonerated. You're free to go." Millie White nodded once. She did not cry. She did not collapse. She sat very still for a moment, and then she stood, and she smoothed her dress with the automatic precision of someone who has spent years arranging her exterior with care, and she walked back across the floor. In the gallery above, Tilly Hancock pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and let herself, finally, cry, without sound, without drama, with the relief of someone who has been holding something for years and has at last found a safe place to put it down. The sale of the White estate was handled by solicitors, which meant that Millie never had to go back to Yorkshire. She was not sure whether this was a relief or an incompleteness, and she thought about it once or twice in the weeks after the inquiry, turning the question over in the way that one turns over something smooth, not searching for a specific conclusion but simply finding out whether it has an edge. Eventually she decided it was a relief, and put the question down, and got on with the business of leaving. She took from the estate her clothing, her books, a respectable collection, acquired quietly over the years from the bookseller in Harrogate who had not asked why a lady of good standing bought books on botany and natural philosophy and the letters of notable women, her writing things, and the small writing desk from the room that had been hers. She did not take the silver letter opener. She thought about it for a moment, standing in the room for the last time, and then she left it on the table and did not look back. She also took, because the law and the inquiry had restored to her the legal standing she had possessed before her marriage, the income of the estate, the rents, the investments, the accounts, all of which the solicitor described, in a slightly apologetic tone that suggested he found the figures embarrassing to have withheld for so long, as quite substantial. She chose York because she did not know anyone there. This was the primary criterion, and she did not find it depressing. Not knowing anyone meant that York could be shaped by what she did rather than by what she had been, and what she had been was a category she intended to retire with the old high-collared gowns that she had already given, without ceremony, to the charity box at the prison before she left Whitmore. She and Tilly arrived in York on a Monday in May, which turned out to be a particularly fine Monday. One of those days that the north of England occasionally produces to remind itself and others that it is capable of light, and the house on Gilligate, which the solicitor had let on her instructions, was smaller than the White estate and had a garden that was slightly overrun and windows that let in the afternoon sun and smelled, for reasons the previous tenant had apparently never investigated, of old lavender. It was not grand. It was, as Millie stood in the front room with the dust still unsettled and Tilly behind her with a trunk, almost aggressively ordinary. "Well," said Tilly. "Yes," said Millie. They hired Mrs. Poppy as cook on the recommendation of the employment agency in Stonegate, a woman of 50 with a voice like a warm hearth and opinions about the proper preparation of roast chicken that she shared freely and that turned out to be correct. She appeared on the first morning with a basket of provisions and a comprehensive assessment of the kitchen's deficiencies and an air of someone who had found what she was looking for, and the house organized itself around her with the ease of things falling into their natural position. The first month was very quiet, and the quiet was a different kind from the quiet Millie had learned to navigate at the White estate. That quiet had been a quality of absence, the absence of permission, the absence of safety, the absence of the self she had been before she understood what she had married. This quiet was the quality of a space that was simply empty, a room before furniture, a page before writing. Not ominous. Not anything, yet. Waiting. She walked. York was a city made for walking, the walls, the river, the old streets that folded over themselves in ways that required attention. She walked them with the systematic interest of someone who is learning a new language by immersion, noting, cataloguing, returning to what interested her. She found a bookseller on Petergate who had an excellent natural philosophy section and who did not, in 3 separate visits, comment on the range of her reading, which was the highest accolade she could imagine awarding a bookseller. She ate without vigilance. This required, at first, a conscious effort, the habit of bracing before meals, the automatic assessment of the mood of the room before choosing how to sit, the old architecture of dinner-table survival, and it took several weeks before she realized, with a feeling that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it, that she had eaten an entire supper without once checking whether anyone in the room was about to speak. She slept with her back to the wall, because certain things are learned in the body and take longer to unlearn than the mind requires. She noticed these things and she noted them and she did not hurry them, because she had been in enough rooms to know that the order of your own recovery is not something you can arrange in advance. Wilson Alexander's first visit was on a Thursday in June, at 10 in the morning, and was explained, in the note he sent ahead, as a matter relating to the estate's legal transfer and the final correspondence from the White solicitor which required her signature. This was true. It was also not the full account. She received him in the small front sitting room, which had by now acquired a rug that was not turned to conceal anything and a set of curtains in a yellow that she had chosen because she had wanted yellow and there had been no reason not to. He arrived precisely on time, which she noted, and he accepted tea, which she poured herself, and he produced the papers and she signed them, and then the papers were signed and there was a pause. "The garden has potential," he said, looking at the window. "It does," she agreed. "Tilly thinks the wall along the south side would support roses. I'm not certain the soil is right." "You'd want to test the drainage first," he said, with the air of someone who has learned more about garden drainage than might have been anticipated. "Clay subsoil holds water badly." She looked at him. "Do you know much about gardens?" "No," he said, "but I've been thinking that I should develop an interest." He said it without inflection, which in another person she might have read as humor. She said that drainage testing was, she believed, usually conducted in autumn. He said he might return in autumn, then, to observe the results. She said that would be fine. He came the following Thursday. And the Thursday after that. Logistics of Wilson's Thursday visits evolved over the summer in the manner of things that are happening without being announced. The estate transfer papers were long since filed. The legal pretext evaporated and was replaced, without discussion, by a standing arrangement that neither of them formally acknowledged and both of them kept with the reliability of people who have decided, independently, that this particular Thursday is the most useful day of the week. They talked about books. She had opinions, and he had opinions, and their opinions did not always agree, which was one of the things she found she valued. They talked about the city, the archaeology of the Roman walls, the guilds, the history of the shambles. He brought her, on one occasion, a journal article about Yorkshire clay soil composition that he had clearly obtained specifically for the conversation, and presented it with a gravity that she found, increasingly, to be a variety of warmth she had not previously encountered in a man. The warmth of someone who takes your interests seriously rather than performing interest in them. She learned that he was afraid of horses, which had been a source of practical difficulty throughout his career and which he described with the particular rueful honesty of someone who has accepted a limitation but would rather you not dwell on it. She mentioned that she had been afraid, for most of her adult life, of closed doors, and he did not ask her to be more specific, and she did not explain further, and they went on talking about the geology of the dales, and the afternoon light moved across the sitting room floor. She told him, one Thursday in August, when the heat had been unusual and the York gardens were very green and they were sitting in the back garden with the rose cuttings that had taken better than expected, what she had been afraid of. Not the summary, not the legal version, not the version that Fowler had confirmed and Burke had documented, but the actual version. The one that happened at night. The one that had never been in any courtroom. He listened. He did not touch her, which she had been, somewhere beneath her certainty, afraid he might do by way of comfort, because certain kinds of comfort from certain kinds of proximity still required adjustment on her part. He simply sat and listened, and when she finished, he said, in the voice he used when something mattered, "You were never mistaken. About any of it." It was a small sentence. It was the sentence she had needed someone to say for 8 years. She looked at the roses and did not say anything, because there was nothing adequate to say, and he understood this without requiring it to be explained. The proposal happened on a Wednesday in October, which was unusual only in that it was not a Thursday and that he had come to the door without advance notice, which he later told Tilly she had found both alarming and, in retrospect, touching. He did not make a speech. He asked her whether she thought she might, in time, be willing to be married again. He added, with precision, that he was asking because he intended to ask her, and he wanted to know before asking whether the question itself was one she had room for. She thought about it. She thought about it seriously and for long enough that a less patient man might have filled the silence, and he did not. She said yes. She said she thought she might. He asked formally the following Thursday, which was more in keeping with procedure. The wedding was in December, small and precise, at the church on Goodramgate, attended by Tilly and Mrs. Poppy and her father, who had come from Cumberland looking somewhat older and somewhat smaller than she remembered him, and who had held her hands in the nave before the service and said, in a voice from which he had clearly been working to remove an emotion he felt he had no right to express in her direction, that he was very sorry. She had looked at him, at the thin knuckles, the grey at his temples, and she had found, to some degree of her own surprise, that sorry was sufficient. Not because it changed anything. Because it was true, and it was enough. Lewis White was not mentioned. The past was not mentioned. What was in the church was the present, the decent winter light through the stained glass, the quiet voice of the rector, the warmth of Wilson's hand which was, she noted, entirely steady. She made, this time, vows she understood the weight of. She kept her eyes open throughout. Olivia Alexander was 8 years old and had been told twice already not to go into her mother's writing room without knocking, but knocking was a rule she observed selectively, as rules which apply to the very good and the very interesting are apt to be observed by children of 8 who consider themselves, with some justification, to be both. The bottom drawer of the writing desk was her particular interest. She had noticed it before, the way her mother's hand sometimes rested on it briefly, not opening it, simply resting, in the manner of someone checking that something is still where they left it. This was a gesture that made the drawer interesting in the way that all carefully kept things are interesting. She was sitting cross-legged on the study floor with the drawer open when her mother appeared in the doorway. Olivia held up the object in question, a silver letter opener, 8 inches long, with a handle shaped like a folded wing. It was wrapped in a square of dark cloth, which she had folded back to see it properly. She held it with the careful reverence she gave to things that were clearly old and important without being able to explain either quality. "What is this?" she said. Her mother stood in the doorway for a moment. She looked at the letter opener, and then at Olivia's face, and then at the letter opener again. Then she crossed the room and sat on the floor beside her daughter, which was not a thing she did very often, and which Olivia registered as significant. Milly took the letter opener gently from Olivia's hands and held it for a moment. Then she wrapped it back in its cloth and set it on the floor between them. "When you are older," she said, "I will tell you the whole story. There is a whole story, and it is not a simple one, and you're going to need to be old enough to hear it properly." Olivia considered this. She was a child who preferred information to its deferral, but she was also a child who had learned, from her mother, that some things are worth waiting for. "How old?" she said. "Older than 8, her mother said. "Is it a sad story?" Milly looked at her daughter, at the dark hair and the direct gaze and the small, serious face that was, in this moment, working very hard at patience. She put the letter opener back in the drawer and closed it. "It was," she said. And then it stopped being. Olivia put her hand, briefly, on her mother's. It was a gesture she had not calculated, the kind of thing that 8-year-olds do because they have not yet learned that comfort requires a reason. Milly looked at her daughter's hand on hers. "Your mother was braver than she ever meant to be," she said quietly. "Not sadly. As a fact." Then, from the garden, Wilson's voice calling them for supper. His particular brand of calling, which was not a shout but a projection, a domestic formality that Olivia had decided was one of the more reliable sounds in her life. Olivia scrambled to her feet. She was already at the door when she stopped and looked back. "Are you coming?" "Yes," her mother said. She rose and followed her daughter out of the study and down the stairs and out into the York garden, which was long and summer green and smelled of warm grass and the climbing rose along the south wall, which had taken very well as it turned out, given the drainage. Wilson was at the garden table, reading, in the long evening light that the north grants sparingly and abundantly by turns. He looked up when they came out. Olivia ran to him the way children run to people they are certain of, without consideration, without checking, with the whole of their momentum. Milly followed her unhurried, one hand trailing along the garden wall, feeling the warm stone beneath her fingers. The evening opened around them all, steady and uncomplicated, and the long Yorkshire light held everything in it. The table and the roses and the sound of her daughter laughing and the smell of Mrs. Poppy's supper from the kitchen window, and none of it asked anything of her except that she be present, which she was. Which, after everything, she was. And that is where we leave Milly White, not on the gallows, but in the light. If this story moved you, hit that like button. It truly helps more people find it. And if you are not subscribed yet, now is the perfect moment. Hit subscribe so you never miss the next chapter. Most importantly, tap that notification bell and select all, because the algorithm does not always send the story to you. You have to ask for it. Until next time, stay curious, stay kind, and I will see you in the next one.